Good day, everybody. My name is Andy Purvis. I'm Director Sustainable Manufacturing with World Steel, and I'm delighted to be acting as Master of Ceremonies for our webinar today. This is the latest and the last of a series of webinars that we've run throughout 2022 based on falling from height, and we've been partnering with 3M, and we've together, I think, based on a lot of the 3M content, delivered a series of events and talks looking at various aspects of this critical topic, which ultimately causes the most of our fatal accidents within our industry. So it's a very important topic. We are closing out our series for 2022 with our final Steel Talk, which is focused on inspection and maintenance of safety equipment used to protect from fall from heights. Clearly, you can have all the equipment in the world, but you need to know you can rely on it when you need it. And a big part of that is how it's inspected, maintained, and used. As usual, we are going to I will hand over to David Baker, one of the specialists from 3M. David, thank you for joining us. I think rather than me do it, I will invite you to introduce yourself and take the webinar from here. I'll pop up again at the end.
Thank you very much, Andy, and thank you everybody for joining. And as always, thanks to World Steel Association and Steel University for allowing us to co-host this series of webinars. Yeah, this is the last in the series this year on work at height and fall protection, and is based on inspection and maintenance. My name's Dave Baker. I work at 3M as the EMEA Application Engineering Product Specialist Leader, and I presented a few of these webinars this year. So if any of you are rejoining, you'll know who I am. And for anybody who's that if this is their first webinar, I've worked in the work at height industry for getting on for 20 years now in a variety of roles. And as I say, I'm currently the application engineering leader within the fall protection business in EMEA for 3M. Okay, so Andy's very correct. We've got quite a packed topic, so let's kick off and get started. If you do have any questions, please put them in the Q&A section rather than the comment section. The Q&A section is it's easier for us to record them and to get back to anybody that we aren't able to answer during the webinar or at the end. So if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A and we'll come back to them at the end. There is somebody monitoring those as we go through as well. Okay, disclaimer, as always at the beginning, just to read through this for you. This presentation provides a general overview of fall protection information and includes various 3M safety solutions. This webinar content should not be relied upon to make specific fall protection equipment selection, use and maintenance choices. Local country or regional regulations and guidance varies, and the responsibility for the correct implementation of a fall protection program in compliance with local country or regional regulations lies with the employer. This presentation should not be relied upon in isolation, as the content is accompanied by additional and/or clarifying information. Thank you. Okay, so let's have a look at the contents of today's webinar. We're going to have a look at the whys, the whens, the whats, and the whos with regard to inspection. We're going to then have a little look around the topic of pre-use inspection and just have a quick look at that in a little bit of in-depth. We've got a video just to show you that process, just one of the tools that we've got to be able to help you with that. We're going to have a look at types of damage that can occur, then the various different types of fall protection equipment. As you'll have no doubt, any of you that have attended any of the webinars previously, you'll know that fall protection covers a very, very wide range, from anchors, body harnesses, connectors, descent and rescue, fall protection for tools, etc. So that fall protection and work at height solutions covers a really wide range, and there's a big variance in there of different types of equipment. So we're going to have a look at some of those. We're going to have a look at service and maintenance, product lifespan, cleaning, storage, and the recording of inspection. So A lot to try and cram in, so I will do my very best. So let's have a look at why do we inspect and maintain fall protection equipment? Well, first and foremost, it's a piece of safety critical equipment. If you are ultimately going to rely on this equipment to save your life, and if you're going to rely on it, you want to know that when you come to call on it, it's going to work. So it's very, very important that it's been inspected and maintained, so that if it is ever called into service, if ever you end up falling and you're relying on that complete system, you're going to want to make sure that every bit of that system is working. And in order to do that, we need to inspect it regularly and we need to maintain it as well. It's also likely that it will be a legal requirement for you to do so. Again, this is a global webinar, so I can't speak for legislation in every country, but in the vast majority of countries, there will be some kind of legislation that requires the inspection or places a need for inspection of personal protective equipment, of which fall protection equipment is part of. So it's very likely that there will be a legal requirement. It will also be almost certainly be a manufacturer's requirement. Okay, so in form of warranties or guarantees of that equipment, it will be a requirement that the manufacturer will state. There will almost certainly be a minimum requirement of inspection required by the manufacturer themselves. And also, it can have a big impact on cost. When you're implementing these systems, there's a not unreasonable amount of capital expenditure that goes into building these systems and putting them together. And so it makes sense to inspect and maintain as part of a cost management program as well. That allows for timely replacements when things are worn, or allows for repair to be carried out in timely fashions, rather than allowing something to get so bad that it actually ends up needing to be completely replaced. So there's numerous reasons why we need to inspect and maintain our fall protection equipment. What about the when? When should we be doing this? Well, there's numerous options here. We should be looking at inspecting before each use. Okay, we'll come back and touch on how we do this, but certainly we should be looking to inspect that equipment before we use it. There may well be, or there will certainly be, a requirement for regular interval inspection. There may well be a specified manufacturer schedule. We said that there's likely to be, the manufacturer will put a minimum requirement on their inspections. So they will almost certainly specify from their side when a minimum set of inspections are. And the final one would be if there was any kind of incident. So if something has happened where the equipment has had to be used, or we think partially used, or perhaps has been caught by another piece of equipment, if it was an installed anchor or a horizontal lifeline that maybe had been caught by a piece of moving equipment, and we were worried that it had been potentially damaged, or if PPE had been left out and we had lost track of where it was, and we weren't sure whether it may have been exposed to perhaps some damage, it may be a requirement to inspect it after an incident as well. So there's numerous times when we need to carry out those inspections. Probably the most the one that is the hardest to quantify is as to when we should do it would be the regular interval. What is a reasonable inspection regime for fall protection equipment that's in use. So let's have a look at what some of the things that might influence when we do a regular inspection. The first one is the type of work that we're doing. Are we doing work in a particularly dirty environment, or are we doing work in a particularly clean environment? If we're in a particularly dirty environment, it may well be that our inspection regime is going to be significantly greater than if we were in a clean room environment, for example. Are we working where there may well be lots of other things going on? Grinding, welding, hot works, cutting, perhaps the prevalence of chemicals, for example. So what type of work are we doing? Are we going to be continually brushing up against things, perhaps dirty or abrasive surfaces? So we need to take into account the type of work. We also need to take into account how frequently the equipment's being used. You know, inspection is also going to be dependent on how often the equipment's being used. If it's only being used to go up on a roof 3 times a year to check gutters and maintain roof lights, that might be significantly different than if it's being used every day when climbing a vertical system on ladders. So the frequency of work will have an impact. Any special conditions, we mentioned things perhaps it might be being used in a hot works environment, or it might be being used in a particularly heavy chemical environment. So if there are any particular special conditions that might expose that fall protection equipment to greater hazards, and perhaps things like working patterns, if the equipment is being booked out on shift patterns where it's away for a long period of time, it may well be that those will dictate when we regularly inspect something, because it might not be available otherwise. And all of those things, when we consider those and others as well, also legislation. So legislation normally puts the absolute minimum standard, and typically you will see in most legislation that's annually. Okay, so all of those things together will give us what we need to choose as our inspection regime, and that could be, as I mentioned, annually. That's generally the minimum standard from a legislative perspective. Most legislation says at least annually. It could be that you deem that it's required every 6 months, quarterly, weekly, or perhaps even a bespoke inspection regime. Particularly if you're working in very aggressive environments, it might be that it needs a regular interval inspection after every time it's used if you're going into a very severe environment. So all of these things will dictate what we deem as our regular inspection interval. So what type of inspection do we do? We know we've got to inspect. We know we've got before each use, we've got regular intervals. So what type of inspections are they? Well, before each use will be a visual inspection. We should be visually inspecting that. So it's not a recorded, we're not taking a checklist out and marking it down, but before we use it, the user, we should be carrying out a visual inspection. The regular interval inspections, those should be recorded. Okay, so we should have a way of recording those inspections, a checklist that we can keep that record. A manufacturer's scheduled inspection may be recorded, but it might also involve a return to the manufacturer in some instances with some PPE, some very specialist parts of PPE, and we'll look at those later on. It might mean that they are needed to be returned to the manufacturer so that they can be serviced before they're brought back to the end user. And if it's after any type of incident, that's going to be a one-off type of inspection. Okay, and again, that would normally be recorded. It might be recorded with a bit more detail, with a bit more context as to regards to the incident and what had happened and why you were particularly looking at some elements of that fall protection equipment. So before each use, visual, the regular intervals, whatever you've determined, whether that's annually, 6 months, bi-weekly, those should be a recorded inspection. Manufacturer may need a return, and after incident is the one-off. And who is it that does these inspections? Who's the person that can do these? So before each use, that should be the user. So the person that's actually using the equipment, before they use it, they should be carrying out a pre-use inspection of that equipment. The regular interval inspections, the recorded inspections, those should be carried out by a competent person. So we're going to have a look at what the definition of a competent person is in a minute, but those should be somebody that's trained and competent to be able to do that. A manufacturer's schedule should be, it could be done by a competent person, or it might be that it needs to actually, go back to the manufacturer themselves to carry out the work. And if there's an incident, a specific incident involving the PPE, that again should be carried out by a competent person. We see this word competent person crop up quite a lot. It can be actually difficult to tie down what is deemed a competent person. And again, this is a global webinar. It may well vary based on where you are. In the UK, for example, a competent person is a person with sufficient skills, knowledge, and experience to perform the task. Or if they're being trained, that they work under the supervision of somebody competent to do it. Okay, so the definition in the UK of a competent person is the sufficient skills, knowledge, and experience to perform that. So whoever's doing your regular interval inspection could be somebody in-house, it could be somebody externally. Whoever it is, they need to be competent. And again, that definition of competent can vary globally. So I would encourage you to make sure that you understand in your areas what the definition of a competent person is. Whichever way, you're going to want to make sure that the person or the people that are doing the inspections are trained. And that training is obviously going to vary. The before each use, the pre-use inspection by the user, that's obviously not as much of an in-depth training, but they still need to know what to look for. They're still going to need to know and understand what it is that they should be looking for. Any regular inspection where it's being recorded and recorded as okay and put back into service, that's going to need to be done by a competent person who really should have some kind of official training or at least some way of demonstrating the skills and the experience. That would usually be through an accredited training course, could be with a manufacturer, or it could be with a training provider. Obviously, if it's going back to the manufacturer, they have the knowledge and the skill from having designed and built the equipment. And the after the incident would also be same as regular interval with a competent person. So we've had a look there at the who, the what, the why, and the when with regards to inspection. So what we're going to do now is have a little look at a video that walks us through the things that we would want to check from a pre-use inspection perspective. So the video is about 4 minutes long. I'll talk on some of the bits, and then afterwards we'll actually have a look at them in a little bit more detail. So a pre-use inspection typically wouldn't take this long to do, but this is a more of a detailed view as to the things that you should be looking out for. So this one focuses on a harness, and the first thing that you would want to make sure is that all of the hardware, all of the metal components, so that's buckles and adjustments and connector points, are okay. So you can see here, checking that buckles are not damaged in any way and that they connect and secure properly, that they can be adjusted, tightened and loosened properly, and that all of that functionality works. Similarly, on any chest connection points, so those were leg connection buckles, these are chest connection buckles, making sure that they work properly, connect. And then where we connect our lanyard or our SRL, our connector too. So this one has a front attachment point and a rear attachment point, making sure that they function correctly, that there's no damage to those. And then finally, on the metallic components, any kind of adjustment. So these are the revolvers, which are unique to 3M products that are used to adjust the chest strap. So here we're just making sure that those function correctly and that there's no damage to those. Once we've checked the metallic components, we're going to want to make sure that there's no damage to the webbing. Okay, so we want to make sure, just have a quick look around the harness, make sure that there's no obvious damage caused to that webbing. That damage can be in the form of cuts and abrasions and wear, perhaps burns. We're going to have a look at these in a little bit more detail after this video. Sometimes webbing can be hidden by pads, comfort padding, so just have a quick look and make sure that there's no obvious damage behind any padding or anywhere where the webbing is secured. Next up is stitching blocks or stitching patterns. So wherever webbing either joins other webbing or comes back on itself through a connection, you can see that we have these stitching blocks. So we're going to want to make sure that there's no damage to any of these stitching blocks, that they're all complete and intact. Any fall indicators, so any kind of the fall indicator is there to show whether or not the harness has been subject to any kind of impact. So on this harness there are two, there's one on the front and one on the rear. You want to make sure that those haven't been deployed. So we can see there, want to make sure that that will show us whether there's been any shock applied to the harness. Then the label, want to make sure that the label is all there, it's all legible, and that we can see it, and that all the information regarding date, serial number, and the testing standards. And then finally, if we have suspension straps or trauma straps, however you'd like to describe them, we just want to make sure that they are there and that they're all okay. Again, you know, in an ideal world, we'd never have to use these. But if you do have to call on them, you want to make sure that they are intact, they've not been damaged in any way, and that when you come to use them, they will function correctly. So that's just a video showing what you would be expected to check from a pre-use check, and that shows with on a harness, but that's equally relevant whether it's any other type of fall protection equipment as well. And we're going to have a look at some of the other types of fall protection equipment in a minute. So there we want to make sure that all the hardware is okay, all the webbing is okay, all the fall indicators, the stitching and the labels. So let's have a little bit of a deeper look. So in terms of the metalwork, what kind of damage are we going to see? We're likely to see potentially cuts. So if you're using grinding equipment or cutting equipment, it's potential that we will see some cuts to those. Cuts can cause a number of problems. The first, obviously, is that they weaken the component itself. The second is that cuts potentially have sharp edges, and that can in turn damage the webbing. So we're not just talking about the integrity of the metallic component, we're also talking about the damage to that metal component has the potential to damage the webbing as well. Cuts or abrasions, if the metal component has rubbed up against something and abraded the metal and perhaps created a sharp edge. Deformations, so if the metal component has perhaps been trapped, maybe it's been driven over by a vehicle. If it's been left on the floor, something's driven over it, maybe it's become trapped between some moving equipment. We want to make sure that there's no deformations, that there's no cracks or fatigue cracks in any of the metal equipment. Impact damage, so again, if it's been caught with between machinery, or perhaps if it's in the back of a van and it's been trapped indoors, it's possible that the hardware can be damaged that way. They are metallic components, so we need to be aware that they can corrode as well, particularly dependent on how they've been stored. We're going to have a little talk about storage later, but we need to be aware that they can corrode. A lot of them, as you would have seen on the harness there, have got treatments to help prevent corrosion, but that doesn't mean that corrosion doesn't occur. Heat damage could be in the form of if it's been exposed to heat, or perhaps even things like welding splatter that could be on there that could prevent metallic components from working properly, and also wear. You can see this one here is sort of shown in this one down here in the bottom. Wear can occur, particularly if you have rope that passes through metallic components and that can rub on those components over a long period of time. It can actually wear away the metal component and significantly reduce the thickness. So we need to be aware that actually the webbing and the rope can wear out metallic components as well, particularly again if it's used in a dirty environment or with sand or perhaps abrasive. That can increase that wear between the webbing and the metallic component as well. And of course, metallic components come in many different forms. They don't just come in the way of buckles on harnesses. We can be talking about carabiners here. So, you know, not just the damage to the metalwork on a harness, it can also be carabiners. We want to make sure that they're not damaged anyway, and also that they function properly. So whether it's a twist gate carabiner or a screw gate carabiner. Here we've got in the middle, this is a device that allows us to connect the SRL, self-retracting lifelines, to the harness. These have various locking pins. We're going to want to make sure that those locking pins function correctly. We have scaff hooks. Again, where these have webbing interacting with them, these are the points at which wear can occur. Quite often they're fitted with this type of plastic sleeve here to prevent that wear both to the webbing and to the metalwork. You can have metalwork that crops up in the middle of lanyards. So if we're adjusting lengths of lanyards, or this is a facility to allow to wrap around steel work. So there will be metalwork in various places on bits of fall protection equipment. This is a rope grab. Typically it would have a rope coming through here. So we need to be aware that there's metalwork on all different types of fall protection equipment and PPE. And we need to inspect it for those types of damage that we showed there in the harness as well. So we need to keep an eye out for those. And again, the pre-use inspection, these will be looked at both from a pre-use and from a regularly recorded inspection. The pre-use is not, again, it's not written down. It doesn't have to take ages to complete. You just want to be aware that those are the things to keep an eye out for. Does everything function as it should? Is there any obvious severe deformation, damage, cracks, corrosion before we start using it? If we look at webbing and rope, so we had a look at the harness there with webbing. This also is relevant for rope as well. What we call sort of textile material. What type of damage can we get with webbing and textile ropes? Well, cuts obviously has a huge impact on the strength of webbing. Even a very small cut can significantly, by orders of magnitude, reduce the effective strength of webbing. So we need to be very aware of cuts. Abrasion, that's where either the webbing or the rope has rubbed up against something abrasive, so perhaps brickwork or perhaps some moving machinery that's got an abrasive surface, can cause abrasion to either to the face of the webbing, and it can actually wear through the fibers. Equally, where webbing crosses each other, you know, if it's been in use for a long period of time and you have webbing on webbing that can rub against each other, that can cause abrasion as well. Dirt ingress, so webbing and even ropes, kern mantle ropes or twisted ropes, by definition they're made up of lots of fibers that cross each other. If you get some webbing and look at it close up, it's lots of fibers crossing, woven fibers together. You can get, if you get dirt that's left on a webbing or rope for a long period of time, it can work its way in between the fibers, and as those fibers move around, as the equipment is used, you can actually abrade the webbing or the rope from the dirt that's ingressed into it. We need to be aware of things like broken threads, heat damage. You know, webbing, standard webbing it can be susceptible to heat damage. So if we're grinding or we're welding, then we looked in our previous webinars, we identified that perhaps we need to use some PPE that's more suitable. So that may be made out of a different material. But equally, just because you're using hot works equipment, it doesn't mean that it's immune from being damaged by heat. It just means that it has a higher threshold to heat resistance. It still needs to be inspected for heat damage to make sure that it hasn't gone past its exposure limit. You haven't gone to a higher temperature, because it can still be damaged by heat. But we need to be aware of heat damage. Chemical damage can often be very difficult to tell with chemical damage. So it's very important that users understand that if they spill chemicals, anything chemical on fall protection equipment, that they let somebody know, and that you can have a look at what the chemicals are and what kind of damage those have done. Because webbing is typically a plastic type material, and certain chemicals can be quite nasty and actually reduce the elasticity of webbing material. So we need to be very careful with chemicals, because once that chemical, perhaps the liquid, has evaporated off or dried, it can be very difficult to see what's left. And as well, ultraviolet damage. UV, again, it's a plastic type product, and we know that ultraviolet light can be particularly damaging to plastic products. So that's particularly relevant if we're working outside in very hot or areas with extreme ultraviolet conditions. But equally, it's relevant to storage as well. When we store these, we want to make sure that they're not stored in ultraviolet light, because that can damage. Hanging in the back of vehicles with a rear window, if there's sunlight streaming in and it's hitting your fall protection equipment, then ultimately it's potentially going to damage that. And that can often be seen with like a bleaching of the color. So sometimes when you remove a bit of webbing that's crossed over, and you can see the webbing behind is one color and the webbing on the top has been bleached, then that's one of the signs of ultraviolet damage. So we need to be aware of that with webbing and rope. And of course, webbing and rope is not just in harnesses and lanyards. It can be in ropes and rope grabs. It can be in self-retracting lifelines. This is a webbing SRL. So again, we've got stitching patterns here. We've got webbing. We've got rope. We can see stitching here. Rope is in rescue. It can be in anchorage devices with webbing slings. So this has stitching and webbing. And it can be in work positioning lanyards as well. So rope and webbing, very, very prevalent in fall protection equipment. We looked at stitching blocks. So stitching blocks are normally typically, well, they are done in patterns. Okay, so we can see here, we use this oval pattern here, and then we use this pattern here with two lines and the oval in between. So it's like a patch. And they're done in a pattern, normally a contrasting color as well. So we've got gray and blue. So you're looking that there is there any type of incomplete pattern or any deformed shape to that pattern? You're looking for the pattern block to be uniform. So we're looking for incomplete patterns, broken lines. Again, the stitching block can become abraded. Okay, particularly I've seen this where people sit down with harnesses on very abrasive surfaces. Then you can get particular wear on the pads where people are sitting on them. The stitching itself can become cut. As I say, this is where we're joining two pieces of webbing together. Either we're coming back through a buckle and stitching back on itself, or perhaps we're having bits of webbing that cross over each other in two different directions, and we want to hold them together. So we're looking for any damage to that stitching in the way of cuts, heat damage, chemical damage, dirt ingress. So very similar to webbing, but actually looking for damage to the pattern block itself, the stitching block itself. Fall indicators. So this is just some close-ups of the fall indicators. This is really just to, you will see these sometimes on lanyards. You see them on harnesses. Sometimes you will actually see them. I didn't put a picture on here, but I should have. You can see them sometimes on self-retracting lifelines or SRLs. They can be in the form of a near the hook, which can pop and show either a green mark or a red mark. So if it's been subject to a shock load, you can see that there's an indicator there. So make sure that fall indicators are complete, they're not broken, and that they haven't been deployed. Okay, so they're not damaged anyway, because any damage to those would potentially show that they've been exposed to a shock load. Labeling, very important with labels, very, very important. If we can't see the label, then really we shouldn't be using that fall protection equipment. We should be removing it from service. So the label, very, very important. That's why with a lot of fall protection equipment, and you saw it there on the harness, labels are often hidden underneath protective wraps. So you have to open some Velcro and then you can see the label. Labels, very, very important because they're going to tell you a number of things. They're going to tell you things like the standards to which the product has been designed and tested to. They're going to tell you manufacture dates. So we're going to talk towards the end, we're going to talk about product lifespan. So that's quite important with establishing how old the harness is, or the fall protection equipment, sorry. They'll have things like lot numbers and model numbers to help to identify the fall protection equipment. A lot of our equipment comes with this RFID tag. So it's a radio frequency identification tag that can be used perhaps with inspection management software. So you can actually put a phone or a device against that, take a reading, and it can be used to help input the data into an inspection log, which can be very useful. So a lot of fall protection equipment coming with what we call RFID. But you'll also find labels or identification labeling on all other fall protection equipment as well. You'll often find it, you can find it on things like anchorage devices. Again, it will tell you the information. It will tell you manufacture dates, serial numbers, and lot numbers. If you don't have identification labels, then you really don't know what you've got. It could be a piece of PPE that's been removed from service. And if that's ineligible, if you can't read it, then you don't know what you're working with. So the label needs to be readable and clear so that you can establish that what you've got is the required piece of equipment and it complies with the relevant standards and it's in date. Okay, so let's have a look at some of the other bits of PPE and see whether there's some unique characteristics that we need to be aware of when it comes to inspection and maintenance of them. So lanyards, well, I mean, lanyards obviously have they have metal components, which we've touched on. They have rope or webbing, and you can see here we've got a rope lanyard, a webbing lanyard, and this is called a bungee lanyard. So this is like a stretchy, so it stretches out slightly longer when it's in tension, and then it compresses down into a shorter lanyard with a bungee. So it's a type of webbing, and you can see they've got stitching on them, sewn joints, sewn connections there with the rope, metal components, but also within lanyards, if it's a fall arrest lanyard, you will also have an energy absorber as well. Energy absorber, as we spoke about when we looked at the fundamentals, we know what that's there for. That's there to keep the load down to an acceptable level on both us, the equipment, and the structure. So it brings the load down to an acceptable level that the system can handle. In Europe, for example, that's 6 kilonewtons. It won't allow a load to go over 6 kilonewtons in Europe. So it's also important that we inspect this and make sure that there's no damage. Comes a variety of different ways. This is a version of ours which has a Velcro cover. You can open that Velcro, you can actually look inside and see the energy absorber, make sure that there's no damage to that. Some of them are wrapped in plastic, shrink wrapped in plastic. Some of that plastic is sometimes see-through, sometimes it's not, but you want to make sure that that block is intact and that there is no damage to that energy absorbing element. Self-retracting lifelines come in a variety of different forms. They can be personal, single or twin, and they can be made either of cable, stainless steel or galvanized cable, or webbing. So again, you will have obviously metal components that you will want to check. Sometimes you will have energy absorbers that you will want to check. You will have webbing, you'll have metal work, but also you're going to want to make sure that the device itself is functioning. So pre-use inspection is doing a pull test, a lock test to make sure that it's locking. So these, we've looked at these before, they function very much. The common analogy is a car seatbelt. So you're going to want to make sure that the locking function works. That's going to be one of your pre-use inspections. And some of these, when we get into the bigger blocks, they can get a little bit more complicated. And actually, these some of these can actually go back for manufacturer service. So the bigger blocks are able to be serviced by manufacturer, and we'll touch on those later. So this is where these can be taken apart. The springs can be checked, the pulls, the gears can be checked, cables can be replaced if they need to be. So some of them are serviceable, some of them aren't. But a variety of different things to check within them. Some of them common with other fall protection equipment, some of them unique to to the SRLs themselves. Anchor points, a couple of different types of anchor point really. We've looked at these in the past. There are removable and then there are fixed. So removable, obviously we would treat these as a metallic type component. So we'd want to check very, very similar to the metallic components that we see on lanyards and harnesses. We're going to want to check similarly for wear, corrosion. We are going to want to check that they function properly. So this one is adjustable. This is a beam anchor. So it's designed to move in and out and lock. So we've got these buttons here that we can press to make these narrower or wider. We're going to want to make sure that those all function. We've got labels on them. Again, here we can see the labeling. So we're going to want to make sure that that's all intact. There are some serviceable parts on these. So actually these sliding blocks can be replaced. So if they're worn, we're going to want to look and check the wear on things like this. Similarly, a beam trolley, we're going to want to make sure visual inspections on those. Is it adjusting properly? Is it locking in place? Do all the wheels turning freely? And then we've got sort of the more permanent anchors, eye bolts, that kind of thing. Now, it could well be that if these are permanently installed, it may well be that these need to be pull tested or load tested in situ. So that's when they're fixed to maybe a concrete or a brickwork or a steelwork structure. It may be that they need to be load tested or pull tested or torque tested. And it may mean that that needs to be done by an external third-party company. Okay, so that's another type of inspection that we need to consider with anchor points is, do they need to be load tested? This type of anchor point removable is not load tested. There's likely to be requirements on permanently installed anchor devices that they are load tested. And again, typically that's annually, but if they're also being used for lifting equipment as well as people, they may fall under a more stringent inspection. That might be a 6-monthly or more frequently, depending on what type of lifting regulations you're operating under. Permanent systems, we looked at these particularly when it came to roof work. So typically these need to be inspected by a third party, by an approved third party. So for 3M, these are actually only available through third party trained installer network, and it would be them that would need to come in and do the inspections on those as well to certify that they're okay. So they're checking things like the cable tension. So if it's a cable system, the cable tension, the torque, all the spacings, all of the fixings that hold these pieces of equipment down to roofs or structure has been tested. In some instances, there may be pull testing that's required on those. So if you've got horizontal systems, cable or rail, it's likely that they're going to need to be tested by an external third party. Then we have other types of systems, vertical lifeline systems. So if we have these on ladders, these will need to be checked by a competent person. Similarly, we've spoken about, this is our M100. So this is a sort of a large davit access system. Again, that will have a need for inspection by a competent person. And this is a piece of bespoke we call FlexiGuard. So it's designed to go over a top of maybe a vehicle or equipment. And that again will need at least a minimum of an annual inspection to sign off that these are okay. Again, these may need to be done. It may well be that you have to bring in a specialist contractor to be able to inspect these. Rescue access or confined space equipment, that's also going to need inspection. So here we can see we've got the davit system with winches and self-retracting lifelines. And again, if this is being used for equipment as well as people, then it may well be that they fall under equipment inspection. So similar to sort of crane inspections. So in the UK, it would fall under LOLA, lifting operations and lifting equipment regulations. So depending on where you are globally, it may well be that there are inspection requirements that are more stringent or more often required than just annually. Similarly with tripods, you know, we need to make sure that the tripods are inspected. All of these are metallic components, and also we're having winches and self-retracting lifelines or ropes and pulleys attached to these that need to be inspected as well. So you can see there's a lot of inspection requirements when it comes to fall protection equipment. It's not just the harness and the lanyard, it's all of the associated equipment needs to be inspected as well. Rescue equipment. One of the big things with rescue equipment is that you know, often it really isn't used very often. You know, quite often rescue equipment is going to sit there for a long period of time. It perhaps might never be used in its entire lifespan, but it's still important that it's inspected regularly. So it's important that you understand what the manufacturer's inspection is. There is normally a couple of options with rescue equipment. If it's rescue equipment that's just in a normal bag, that the usual minimum, the manufacturer's minimum is annually on hours. So you'll need to check if there are other manufacturers, whether they have different inspection schedules. But it's also, it's important you understand what the manufacturer's inspection schedule is. There are options that these can go into sealed bags. So these can go into a bag where they're sealed from the environment. And if that is the case, they on our one we have a humidity indicator. Provided that humidity indicator stays within the allowed limits, then you don't need to open it and do a physical inspection every year. Okay, so if it's open to the environment, it needs to be inspected annually, is our requirement. Obviously, if it's used, then after a certain period of use, it would need to be inspected. But if it can sometimes be in a sealed bag that allows it, as long as it stays in that sealed bag with the humidity indicator at the right level, then it can be left, in our case, it can be left for 10 years. So there are some variations with regard to rescue equipment, but it's important, again, that we understand what those are and that we factor those into our inspection schedule. One thing that I do just want to raise is some with regard to fall protection equipment, and we've spoken about sort of things that directly impact the PPE. So if we're grinding or cutting or welding, or we're in a particularly dirty environment with lots of dust and the harness is getting perhaps dirty or covered in grime and dirt, those are sort of direct things that affect the harness or the fall protection equipment, sorry. It's also important that we understand the general environmental factors as well, okay? So it's important to note any specific environmental factors in general that may have an impact on personal fall protection equipment lifespan. So for example, if we are operating in a particularly harsh chemical environment, that can have an impact on materials that builds up over time. So and that should be accounted for. So particularly if we have environments that we've seen, for example, with high chlorine environments, those can have an impact on metallic components that can shorten the lifespan. So it's important that we understand where is it being perhaps stored or where is it spending most of its life. And if it is in an environment that's particularly harsh in general, then it may well be that we have to increase our inspection regime, and also that we have to increase our cleaning regime, and maybe that we might need to introduce some specialist inspection as well to make sure that the environment hasn't impacted the equipment as well. So those are important things to consider as well. Product lifespan. So a number of factors that go into product lifespan. So product lifespan is determined first and foremost by the type and frequency of use and inspection. Okay, so once a product no longer passes inspection, it should be removed from service and destroyed and or made safe. Okay, I've seen equipment that's made safe and used in training to show what can happen from a wear and tear perspective, but we want to make sure that that fall protection equipment can't ever get back into what I would call the general population of fall protection equipment. So ideally it's removed and destroyed, and regardless of whatever a manufacturer says is a maximum lifespan of a piece of equipment, the main governing factor should be, does it pass inspection? If it isn't passing inspection, then even if a manufacturer says this has a 10-year lifespan, if it's being used every day in a harsh environment and it might only last 2 years and it's worn out, it needs to be removed after 2 years if it's worn out and the inspection tells us so. Okay, so the primary thing is an inspection is going to determine. If it fails that inspection, then it needs to be removed from service. Okay, maximum lifespan is often quoted by the manufacturer, and it can vary, okay, from manufacturer to manufacturer. So it's important that you understand this. I've seen lifespans of 5 years, I've seen lifespans of 10 years, and I've seen no lifespans at all. So it's important to understand sometimes there are manufacturer maximum lifespans, particularly on webbing components, and that can differ between webbing and metallic. So metallic components and webbing and rope components can have different maximum lifespans. Typically with metal components, provided it continues to pass inspection, it can remain in service. So metallic components can really don't tend often to have a lifespan. Webbing components are the ones that often do. But as I said, this varies between manufacturers, and so it's important to understand what the difference is and what those are. But ultimately, it's inspections that determine how long things last. So just going to show a very quick video on cleaning. It is possible that we can clean. So we spoke about dirt becoming a problem if it gets into rope and webbing. So it is possible that we can clean rope and webbing in PPE. So here's just a demonstration. We recommend use of just ordinary laundry detergent, max 55 degrees C water. This is a European. Harnesses, so again, depending on where you are and what your manufacturer, read your manufacturer's instructions to make sure that you understand. But you can see that it is possible to clean rope and webbing. You can use non-abrasive cleaning, so a soft brush, a nail brush, for example, can be used to clean stitching, metallic components, and webbing. So all of those can be cleaned, hand washed, and then important then that we make sure that once we've done the washing in the detergent, we then switch that water out for clean water, and we then rinse that through, so we can rinse that out in clean water. And then finally, that we allow the fall protection equipment to hang and to drip dry, so we don't we are not hanging it out in the sun, we're not hanging it over heaters, for example, we're not putting it in the tumble dryer, we're not hanging it over radiators or trying to accelerate that drying. Just allow it to dry in a warm room environment. Okay, so it is possible to clean fall protection equipment. Those are our instructions, by the way. So again, I would encourage you to make sure that you read the manufacturer's instructions on cleaning, so that you understand there will be some things that it's not possible to clean. So it's important that you read the instructions and that you understand, but you can see that with our equipment, it is possible to clean harnesses, it is possible to clean lanyards, etc. Storage, we touched on storage. Storage can have a big impact on the life expectancy or the lifespan of fall protection equipment. So when we finished using it, we've got storage for harnesses and lanyards, for winches, SRLs, for rescue kit, for tripods. If we put things in storage bags, they're far less likely to be damaged by ultraviolet, by dirt, dust, or by impact as well. There can be protection against all of those things. So important to use the correct storage as well with fall protection equipment that can significantly increase its lifespan if it's looked after and cared for with the correct storage. Some equipment, and we spoke about this particularly with the self-retracting lifelines, some equipment is available to go back to the manufacturer for service and repair. So professional maintenance and repair of equipment, key part of fall protection. So gear that's worn, broken, or past maintenance thresholds, it increases the risk to the workers and equally to those that are working underneath or bystanders potentially as well. So there is the opportunity to send back to manufacturer. We have a number of options that we offer for that. It can either come back to 3M factory service and repair, so it can come back to 3M. We have authorized or approved service centers, so we have people that are authorized to service the equipment. It can go to them and be serviced. So we don't have manufacturer in every country, so that it can go back to an approved or an authorized service center. In certain cases, we can have certified end user service and repair as well. So a number of ways. And you can see that's for self-retracting lifelines, load arresters, rescue and descent devices, and confined space equipment. So we can do the service on those types of equipment. That's where they have sort of more complicated gearing, pulleys, pawls, springs, etc. inside them. So blocks, fall arrest blocks, or self-retracting lifelines. And it is also possible that those people can do the certified annual, or even, if you deem it more necessary, the certified inspection of harnesses and lanyards. So there are external third parties that can do those inspections, those recorded inspections for you as well. And then finally, it's important that we make sure that we record those inspections. When we're doing not the pre-use inspections, but if we're saying it's a 6-monthly or an annual or a bi-monthly inspection, that where we're doing a proper recorded inspection, it's important that we have a way of documenting that and keeping those records. A number of reasons to have those formal inspection records. Obviously, they prove compliance with any legislation, so any kind of audits, any kind of safety checks. You're going to have those records of all the inspections going back through time. They can be very handy for the person that's doing the inspection to see what the history has been. They can look back on that piece of equipment and see perhaps some of the things that were picked up by the previous inspector. So that might give an indication into wear patterns or how long equipment is likely to be last, and perhaps give some guidance into replacement schedules as well, and when equipment is likely to need to be replaced, can allow for planning going into the future for replacement equipment. And obviously, if there is any kind of incident involving that equipment, they'll be very, very important that the records that show that equipment was inspected and maintained throughout its life. So if there is ever an incident, it will be important from an inspection perspective by whoever the body that's inspecting it. In the UK, it'd be the HSE, for example. They would want to be able to review and see that equipment had been properly kept and maintained. Okay, that was we're pretty much bang on time, 59 minutes, quite a lengthy webinar, a lot to go through, but a very important topic. So just as a recap, we've looked at the why, when, what, and who. We've looked at the type of things that we would look for in pre-use inspection, the types of damage that can occur. We've looked at the various different bits of fall protection equipment and how perhaps the inspection, service and maintenance of those might vary. We've had a look at service and maintenance and what can come back and what can be done in terms of rebuilding and repairing, product lifespan, cleaning, storage, and recording of inspections. So I think, Andy, that brings us pretty much to bang on the hour.
It does almost perfectly, David. Well done.
Almost.
I mean, thank you for that.
No problem.
As I said at the start of this this webinar. This kind of comes to the end of a series of webinars we've run through the year. There was a lot of information in this one. There's a lot of information in all of them, but please bear in mind that all of the previous webinars and this one have been recorded. We've covered all kinds of topics over the year, from scaffolding, I think about mobile work platforms, rescue, confined spaces. All that is available via the Steel University website if you wanted to go back and review what you've done. I don't think we have any questions directly. There's a lot of information for people to think about. I said this is the end of the series, but clearly, the topic's not done. This is still the most common cause of fatality in the industry, something we need to keep working on. But I guess I do find myself hoping at the end of this year, there's at least one person with their family who might not have been if it wasn't for the efforts of 3M and the Steel University team and you guys for listening, participating, and asking questions. I mean, that's why we do this. And I thank 3M for their support. I thank the Steel University team for their support, for Carlos, who isn't here today, for his support as well. We will move on to another topic next year. We will continue to deliver useful, hopefully, webinars via Steel University to the team, but that's probably a good note for me to end. Thank you again. I wish all of you a successful remainder of 2022 and a successful start to 2023. Please stay in touch with World Steel via our socials. You can follow 3M as well if you want to find out more about this topic. And I think we'll close there. So thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks, everybody.